It took just one slap on my son's birthday to shatter what little faith I had left in my parents. I used to think that time would soften old wounds, that growing up, moving out, and building a life of my own would finally earn me the respect I never seemed to get at home. But some cracks run too deep. Some seeds, once planted, keep growing, even when you're not there to water them. My name is Mark. I'm 35 now, husband, father of 2, and a man who's worked hard for everything. He has. I don't come from wealth, and I sure didn't get a head start in life. What I got was a younger brother named Tommy, and parents who treated him like he was spun from gold. From the moment he was born, the world, our world, revolved around Tommy. If he sneezed, birthday plans were canceled. If he failed a test, it became a family emergency. Meanwhile, I brought home straight A's and perfect SAT scores just to get a pat on the head. If I was lucky, I left home at 18, worked 2 jobs to pay for college, met my wife, Darla, at a small software company where we both started out. We got married 5 years ago. Our son, James, just turned 3, and our baby girl, Emma, came into the world 6 months ago. We've built something steady, something safe. Meanwhile, Tommy stayed right where I left him, at home with Mom and Dad. No degree, no job worth mentioning, just video games and the dream of being a famous streamer. They paid for everything, his gear, his car, his insurance, even his snacks. And somehow they always found a reason to say, he's just sensitive, he needs more time. I stayed away, quietly. I thought that was enough to keep the peace. But peace, in my family, is like porcelain. It looks beautiful from a distance. Get too close, and all you see are the cracks. Last year, we hosted my son's first birthday at my parents' insistence. I should have known better. A spilled plate of food, a ruined t-shirt, a slap that echoed across the backyard and burned into my skin. And when I turned to my parents for help, for the first time in years, I didn't find support. I found a mother cradling the hand that hit me, a father frowning at me like I was the disappointment, and that was just the beginning. Because 2 years later, the same parents who once told me to leave their house came knocking on my door, crying, begging. Why? Because the golden boy they gave everything to had just stolen the one thing they never told me was mine all along. They say the home is where you're supposed to feel safest, where you can fall and someone will catch you, where your victories are celebrated and your tears are dried. But for me, home always felt like a stage I never auditioned for, and Tommy, my younger brother, was the star of every act. I still remember my 10th birthday. I had been counting down the days, excited about the cake, the balloons, the chance to finally have something that was mine. I remember the morning like it was yesterday. Mom walking into my room, her face tight and worried. "Tommy has a cold," she said. "We can't risk him getting upset. We'll cancel the party." I was stunned. Not angry, just empty. He didn't even have a fever, just a little sniffle. But somehow that was enough to erase my birthday. Mom promised we'd celebrate another day. But we never did. It wasn't the last time something that mattered to me got pushed aside because of Tommy. As we grew up, the pattern stayed the same. I was the debate team captain, straight A's, even got a partial scholarship, based on my SAT scores. But at every parent-teacher night, Mom and Dad's attention was somewhere else, on Tommy's C grades, on how his teachers could better support his creative learning style. It didn't matter how high I flew, they only seemed to look down at him, where all their concern was rooted. I was just expected to do well, to manage, to not need anything. It's funny, isn't it? You spend your childhood trying to earn your parents' attention, thinking maybe if you just did a little more, one more trophy, one more certificate, they'd finally say, "We're proud of you." But those words? They were reserved for Tommy when he passed math with a C-. When I was 16, I started to realize that being the responsible one wasn't a compliment. It was a burden. It meant they could stop checking in on you, stop worrying about you, and pour every ounce of themselves into the one who needed more. By 18, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up and left for college out of state. It wasn't easy. I worked the late shift at a diner, then coded freelance projects until sunrise just to pay rent. But it was mine. My struggle, my progress, my quiet victories. Meanwhile, back home, Tommy flunked out of community college after one semester. Said it was too stressful. He moved right back into the room I used to sleep in, filled the house with the hum of gaming consoles and late-night laughter through his headset. My parents? They didn't just allow it. They built his little world around him, paid his bills, bought him gear, drove him to gaming conventions like they were escorting royalty. I used to think maybe, just maybe, it was my imagination, that I was exaggerating things in my head. But then, years later, my wife Darla would look at me across the dinner table and say, "Mark, do they even know you're their son?" And in that moment, I realized something I'd buried for years. Wasn't just the overlooked child. I was the placeholder, the backup plan, the invisible one who made it easier for them to believe they were still good parents. Because I didn't scream. I didn't slam doors. I didn't need rescuing. But that doesn't mean I wasn't hurting. Leaving home at 18 was like stepping out into the cold with nothing but the clothes on your back. There was no send-off party, no teary goodbye at the bus station, just a quick hug from Mom, a distracted nod from Dad, and the sound of Tommy yelling at his game console as I closed the door behind me. But honestly, I didn't expect anything more. I had learned by then not to expect much. I took the acceptance letter, folded neatly in my back pocket, and boarded a Greyhound bus to a small university town 2 states away. I didn't have much money, no safety net, just a quiet promise to myself. I was going to make something of this life, on my own. The first few years were rough. I worked the graveyard shift at a Greasy Spoon diner, poured coffee for truckers, cleaned tables long after midnight. Between shifts, I took classes in computer science, slept in a rented attic room that smelled like old books and cold winters. But I kept going. Every line of code I wrote felt like a brick I laid with my own hands, building something real, something mine. And somewhere in between final exams and coding marathons, I met Darla. She was sharp, funny, and she noticed things. Not just big things, but the way I never called home, the way I tensed up when she asked about holidays or family. She never pushed, just listened. And in that quiet, patient way of hers, she showed me what real care looked like. We got married 5 years ago in a simple ceremony. Just a few friends, some laughter, and a whole lot of hope. Darla wore blue flowers in her hair and whispered to me during our vows, "This is our beginning, Mark. No ghosts allowed." When James was born, everything changed. Holding him, tiny, warm, with those searching eyes, I felt something I'd never known as a child. Unconditional love. It didn't matter what grades he'd get someday or what job he'd have. He was mine, my boy, and he would always know he was wanted. Meanwhile, back home, things hadn't changed at all. Tommy was now 28, still living in the same room, still playing games deep into the night, still avoiding full-time work, like it was the plague. He had dropped out of community college after just one semester, citing mental exhaustion. He worked part-time at a video game store down the street, but that barely lasted. Most of his time was spent live streaming, to a handful of internet followers, chasing the dream of becoming a famous gamer. Mom and Dad? They were still funding it all. Game consoles, monthly subscriptions, new headsets, car insurance. They even helped him finance a custom gaming chair because he said his back hurt from sitting too long. When I asked, once, gently, if they'd ever considered encouraging him to find something more stable, my mother's eyes welled up with tears. "You don't understand, Mark," she whispered, clutching her chest. "Tommy's just different. He's sensitive. You've always been the strong one. The strong one." That phrase again, like a blessing and a curse rolled into one. They said it like it was praise, but what they really meant was, we don't have to worry about you, so we won't. I watched from afar as they poured everything, every last drop of energy, money, and faith, into the same son who had never stood on his own 2 feet, and I tried, God knows I tried, to let it go, to focus on my wife, my son, the life we were building. But the thing about families is, they don't just disappear. Even when you shut the door, they linger. In holidays not called, in milestones not shared, in birthdays forgotten. And deep down, I think I knew. As much as I wanted to, pretend I had moved on completely, something was still waiting to break. James was turning 1. It was a big moment for us. Not because of the balloons or the cake, but because it marked a full year of love, sleepless nights, giggles, and first steps. A year of learning how to be a dad and trying to do it better than the example I had. We wanted something simple. A backyard picnic with close friends, a few toys, nothing fancy. But when my mother found out, she insisted we have it at their house. Let your brother be part of it, she said. He'd love to celebrate with his nephew. I hesitated. Every instinct in me said no, but Darla, ever the peacemaker, gently nudged me. Let's give them a chance, she whispered. Maybe it'll be good for James to know his grandparents. So we agreed. That morning I arrived early to help decorate the backyard. We hung up streamers, tied balloons to the chairs, and set out little party hats. James waddled around with one in his mouth, squealing with delight. For a while it felt normal, almost peaceful, until lunchtime. I was walking back from the buffet table, a paper plate in my hand, piled high with pasta and salad. I was scanning the crowd, looking for Darla, when I turned and bumped into someone behind me, Tommy. My elbow nudged his chest, and a splotch of marinara sauce splashed onto his shirt, a brand-new limited-edition gaming tee, the kind fanboys wait weeks to get their hands on. I froze. Tommy, man, I'm so sorry. I'll pay to clean it. Or buy you a new one, seriously. But he didn't hear me. Or maybe he did, and just didn't care. His voice exploded like a firecracker. You ruin everything, Mark. You always have. Heads turned. He was shaking with rage, his face flushed. And then, out of nowhere, he brought his hand across my face. The slap was loud, sharp, the kind of sound that silences a backyard. My plate hit the grass. My cheek burned. James started crying somewhere behind me. Darla gasped. And my parents, my mother rushed past me. Not to me, but to Tommy. Oh my God, sweetheart. Did you hurt your hand? She asked, cradling it as if it were the one that had been struck. He just doesn't understand how important that shirt was to you. I stood there, frozen, not because of the slap, but because of the silence that followed. Not a single word of concern, not a single look in my direction. My father folded his arms and gave me a long, disappointed stare. Like I had failed them by being assaulted, I finally found my voice. Are you really okay with your son getting hit on his own child's birthday? Mom didn't blink. You're older. You should know better. You should have watched where you were going. He saved for weeks to buy that shirt. That was it. Something inside me cracked wide open, all the missed birthdays, all the backhanded praise, all the years of being the strong one, while Tommy got excuse after excuse. It all came flooding out. I let them have it, not with anger, but with truth. I told them how they had enabled Tommy's behavior for years, how they'd missed my graduation for his gaming tournament, how they'd barely shown up at my wedding, or visited James since he was born, because Tommy wasn't comfortable around babies. When I finished, my father raised his voice. If you can't respect your brother, then leave. So I did. Turned to Darla, scooped up my crying son, and walked straight out of that backyard, streamers fluttering behind us like broken promises. Later that night, the calls began. Mom, Dad, cousins, all telling me to apologize, for provoking Tommy, for overreacting, for ruining the family moment. But I knew better. That slap was never just about the shirt. It was everything. All the years of being ignored, diminished, dismissed. All the times I swallowed the hurt to keep the peace. That slap was the final punctuation on a sentence I had spent my whole life writing, and for the first time in a long, long while, I chose to walk away. It had been almost 2 years since that birthday, 2 years of silence. No phone calls, no texts, no holidays, just peace. James had started talking in full sentences. Emma had been born, a tiny bundle of hope wrapped in pink. Darla and I had bought a bigger house, settled into a rhythm that felt real, healthy, whole. For once, I felt like I was living in a home where I belonged. And then the phone rang. It was an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something, instinct maybe, told me to pick up. It was my mother. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. Her voice cracked, breaking under a weight I couldn't quite place. "Mark, please, we don't know what to do. He's selling the house. Our house." I stood still. Our house. What followed left me speechless. Tommy, sweet, sensitive, always excused Tommy, had somehow transferred the house into his name and was now selling it. He gave them 2 weeks to pack up and get out. And then came the real gut punch. The house wasn't even theirs to begin with. It was mine. My grandfather, Dad's father, had left it to me in his will 15 years ago when I had just started college. I was young. I had no idea. And apparently, they never told me. They had planned to keep it a secret. Just until the right time, my mother said. They wanted to wait until Tommy was more stable, hoping one day he'd inherit it. That had been the plan all along. They'd even lived in it rent-free for 15 years, all while watching me scrape together money for my first tiny condo. They let me struggle while giving everything to him. I didn't speak. I just listened. Listened to the sound of my mother sobbing, not because of what they'd done, but because Tommy had turned on them. After everything, he had found my grandfather's will tucked away in some old box. That's when the gears started turning. He had questions, got curious, then sneaky. During a family vacation while my parents were out of town, Tommy submitted forged paperwork, claimed I gave him power of attorney, said I'd signed the house over to him voluntarily. I hadn't. Not a single paper, not a single signature. But he was smart about it. Used fake names, online guides, maybe even hired help. The documents looked official, clean, good enough to fool the right people. I called a lawyer the next morning. She confirmed everything. The house was legally mine. It had always been mine. And the paperwork Tommy submitted, full of forgeries. It took almost 3 months of legal proceedings, but we got it back. We proved fraud, revoked the transfer, and evicted him. On the day the officers came to escort him out, he locked himself in his room, screaming that we were all against him. When they finally opened the door, he refused to walk, sat on the floor like a child, arms crossed, blaming everyone but himself. That should have been the end. But it wasn't, because a week later, my parents showed up at my door, not calling, not asking, just there, in my driveway, collapsed, on the pavement like their world had ended. My father was crying. I had never seen him cry before, not once, in my whole life. They said they had nowhere to go, no money, no savings, no backup plan. Every dollar they had went to Tommy. His tuition, his car, his gaming equipment, even his rent when he claimed he was going to build a streaming empire, all gone. Gone for a son who took and took and took, until there was nothing left. They begged me to let them stay. I wanted to say no. God, I wanted to. But Darla, she touched my hand and whispered, "We should set the rules." but maybe they finally understand. So I did. With conditions, they would pay rent, reduced but consistent, they would attend family therapy, and they would never, never let Tommy into my home again without my permission. They agreed. Broken, ashamed, too tired to argue. Later, they admitted everything. That they always saw signs in Tommy. That they'd hoped he would grow out of it. That they thought I didn't need them because I was the strong one. My father said something I'll never forget. We gave him everything because we were afraid. Afraid of what he'd become if we didn't. And in the end, we created exactly that. Tommy wrote me an email not long after. Long, apologetic, full of therapy talk, new jobs, promises. He wanted to move back in with them. I said no. Forwarded the message to my attorney and blocked his address. Because even though I'd inherited that house, I earned everything else. It's been 6 months. 6 months since my parents moved in under new terms. Rent, therapy, boundaries. 6 months of awkward dinners and quiet apologies, of unpacking years of silence in a therapist's office, one painful layer at a time. They're trying. I'll give them that. Some days it feels like maybe we're mending something. Other days, it just feels like we're living among ruins, trying to remember where the walls used to stand. My mother still slips sometimes. She'll mention Tommy's struggles, his job at the warehouse, the car payments he's behind on. But now I look her in the eye and say, he's an adult. He made his choices. And so did you. And she nods. Sometimes with tears, sometimes with shame. But she nods. My father is quieter these days, more present. He watches James play in the yard and says things like, "You're a good dad, Mark." It still catches me off guard. Maybe it always will. Tommy hasn't been back. He's couch surfing, last I heard. Still blaming everyone but himself. Still sending dramatic emails I never read. I've learned something these past few years. Forgiveness is not about forgetting. It's about choosing peace over poison, and peace requires boundaries. Letting my parents stay wasn't weakness. It was a choice, with terms. And if they ever break those terms, they'll be out again. Because love without respect isn't love. It's dependency dressed in guilt. I look at James now, 3 years old, wild curls bouncing as he runs across the living room. Emma in Darla's arms, cooing at the ceiling fan like it's the most fascinating thing in the world. This is the family I chose to build, and it's stronger because I protected it. So, to anyone out there listening, anyone with scars that your family told you to hide, with pain you were taught to swallow, with siblings who took too much and parents who looked the other way, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not wrong for walking away. You are not cruel for saying no. You are not unkind for demanding respect. Family isn't who shares your blood. It's who honors your boundaries. Who sees your worth, not just your obedience. Sometimes, to save your peace, you have to build a fence where there once was a door, and that's okay. Thank you for listening to my story. If it spoke to you, even just a little, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and join me again. Because out here, there are more stories like this than you think, and maybe, just maybe, sharing them can help someone else find their own way home.